Hello everyone, and welcome to this Diablo 3 dungeon guide for the Crusader Seeker of the Light set. We'll be going over how to set up your character, and I'll also explain how to complete both primary dungeon objectives. Keep watching until the end to see a full playthrough of the entire set dungeon with additional tips. To get started, let's first take a look at the set bonuses so we'll know how to gear out our character. This set revolves around the Blessed Hammer and Falling Sword skills. Blessed Hammer is our main damage dealing attack, while Falling Sword provides a toughness bonus. Casting Falling Sword back to back to back is also required for completing one of the primary dungeon objectives. Luckily, hitting enemies with Blessed Hammer reduces the cooldown of Falling Sword via the 2-piece set bonus, making this objective easier to complete. Hitting enemies with Blessed Hammer also reduces the cooldown of the Provoke skill, which is the main source of wrath generation in our build. Therefore, considering all of this, cooldown reduction is the main priority for the gearing and skills setup. In this setup, here are the recommended items. The most critical piece to obtain is Cam's Rebuttal. This legendary power will provide an extra, free cast of Falling Sword. It is not recommended to attempt the dungeon without it. These items offer cooldown reduction, which will make it easier to cast Falling Sword back to back. And these items all offer bonuses to Blessed Hammer, which is our main damage dealing attack. It will make it much easier to kill enemies in the dungeon. Note that the legendary power on the Sacred Harness belt will cast the Judgment skill automatically when you cast Falling Sword. This will immobilize enemies and is what will trigger the Hammer Jammer's legendary power. And here are the skills. Both Blessed Hammer and Falling Sword are mandatory for the dungeon. The Rapid Descent rune choice for Falling Sword is important to help with the skill's cooldown reduction. Akarat's Champion is a common staple of Crusader builds, and we take it here to increase damage output and resource generation. You'll mainly want to try to use this on elite monsters to help kill them off more quickly. Laws of Valor with the Unstoppable Force rune combined with the Long Arm of the Law passive skill will help you maintain Wrath resource to be able to cast Blessed Hammers as needed to kill off enemies. The Provoke skill is the main source of resource generation, so cast it as much as possible whenever its cooldown is expired to help replenish Wrath or stay topped off. Now let's go over the dungeon objectives. The first primary dungeon objective is to cast the Falling Sword skill 3 times within 15 seconds and do this 3 separate times. The Cam's Rebuttal legendary power will make this objective much easier to complete. Without it, it would require careful grouping of enemies to trigger the cooldown reduction from the Rapid Descent rune on the Falling Sword skill, so it is not recommended to attempt the dungeon without this power equipped. With Cam's Rebuttal, you'll get a free second cast of Falling Sword right away before the cooldown is triggered. So in order to complete this objective, you'll cast Falling Sword 1 time, then cast it again right away a second time. Then hit enemies with the Blessed Hammer skill as much as possible to reduce the cooldown of Falling Sword. Once the cooldown is expired, then cast Falling Sword a 3rd time to make progress toward the dungeon objective. Note that you don't have to hit enemies with the Falling Sword skill, you only need to cast it. But hitting them will reduce the cooldown on the skill, which will make it even easier to complete the objective. A good approach for the sequence is to use your first cast of Falling Sword on just a few enemies or possibly even no enemies at all. Then use your second cast of Falling Sword to hit as large of a pack of monsters as you can to reduce its cooldown up front. Each enemy hit will reduce the cooldown via the Rapid Descent rune. Then use Blessed Hammer on any residual enemies until Falling Sword is ready again. And then cast it again for the 3rd time, hitting enemies or not. If your damage output is too high, then you might have to tone it down. If you kill enemies too quickly, then you may not be able to get enough hits with Blessed Hammer or the second cast of Falling Sword to be able to reset the cooldown on Falling Sword for the 3rd cast. The second primary dungeon objective is to not get hit by a single mortar. Mortars are cast by the large elite monsters in the dungeon. Getting hit a single time will cause you to fail this objective, so it is extremely important for you to keep a vigilant eye on the edges of your screen as you're moving throughout the dungeon, looking for either the elites themselves or the mortars that they cast. If you spot an elite, stay at range until they shoot some mortars out. Then quickly get close to them within melee range and stay there next to them until they're dead. As long as you're in melee range, you cannot get hit by the mortars. Alternatively, you can use Falling Sword to jump onto the elites from a distance and avoid their mortar cast altogether. Next, let's take a look at the dungeon map. This dungeon has a fairly straightforward layout. It consists of a main pathway heading out from the dungeon entrance with a few offshoot hallways that you'll need to cover. You will have to backtrack in each of these offshoots, so some movement speed will be helpful to get you back to the main pathway quickly. But overall, you don't have to worry about learning or memorizing a specific route to take. Just make sure to head down each of the offshoots as you pass by them. Since there's really no grouping that's required to complete the dungeon objectives, there's no special focus areas related to the monsters themselves. Just make sure to uncover all of your minimap and kill all the enemies as you go, so you won't have to pass back through the dungeon a second time looking for stragglers. So now that you have the setup and you know how to approach the dungeon, let's head to it. Go to Act 2, then to the Ancient Waterway waypoint. From there, head into the waterlogged passage. Then head northwest. The dungeon entrance is just to the right at the end of the hallway. And next we'll look at the playthrough. For this run, I went with pretty bare bones gear to demonstrate techniques. I had to equip the Cam's Rebuttal legendary power to reliably complete one of the primary dungeon objectives. Any additional items or stats that you get, consistent with the recommendations earlier, will give you a much easier time completing the dungeon. Once inside the dungeon, head out to the first group of monsters. It's usually safe to use Steed Charge right away down this first initial stretch. As soon as you see some enemies, cast Falling Sword 2 times back to back. Then hit Laws of Valor to reduce your resource cost, and start attacking with Blessed Hammer. Your goal is to hit as many enemies as you can to reset the Falling Sword cooldown, and as soon as it's reset, cast it a 3rd time to make progress toward the first primary dungeon objective. At this junction, you'll want to head down and clear the 2 offshoot hallways before moving deeper into the dungeon. When you're ready, go through your cast sequence again. Hit Falling Sword 2 times back to back, then attack with Blessed Hammer to reset its cooldown, and then cast it a 3rd time when it's ready. As you're working your way forward, keep attacking enemies to kill them off and keep the area clear so you'll have room to deal with elites when you see them. Keep an eye out for mortars, and get into melee range with elites as soon as you can. Once in melee range, you don't have to worry about dodging the mortars any longer, because they can't hit you when you're that close. Make sure you clear the offshoot hallways thoroughly so you won't have to come back looking for stragglers. Use Steed Charge, especially in these spots, when you're working to get back to the main path. Go through your cast sequence again when Falling Sword is ready. And there we completed the first primary dungeon objective with a tremendous amount of time to spare. It's good to get this objective out of the way pretty early, so that you can then just focus on avoiding the mortars from the elites while you're killing enemies. This is another good spot to use Steed Charge in this longer straightaway section. Just don't rush past monsters into the middle of a large pack. Try to keep enemies in front of you as best you can. Otherwise, you might get trapped and then get hit by a mortar that you can't move away from. Here's the next junction, where you'll need to clear out 2 more offshoot hallways. Whenever you see an elite or their mortars on the edge of the screen, try to stay at range until the mortar cast is complete, or use Falling Sword to get in close. Since the first primary dungeon objective is already complete, you can now reserve Falling Sword to use it specifically for getting close to elites. Get into melee range quickly and stay there until they're dead. Throughout the entire dungeon, while you're casting Blessed Hammer, make sure to cast both Laws of Valor and Provoke as often as you can to help keep your Wrath resource topped off. The elites should always be your primary targets, and let your Blessed Hammers kill enemies in the surrounding vicinity as they spin around. If you don't have a lot of toughness, you'll need to be very careful around the elites. They have big, powerful swings that can easily deal fatal damage. Be ready to use your health potion if needed, and keep attacking to benefit from life on hit. If things get dire, don't be afraid to use Steed Charge to get away and buy yourself some time, to let your health potion cooldown reset, or let your health regenerate. Just keep looking out for mortars to avoid them. You can also leverage Falling Sword to buy yourself a little time and to interrupt the elites. And we're done. Good luck trying to finish this one. If you enjoyed the guide and would like to see more content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.